Our problem is research.
Yeah.
We've got about 14 guides, and they're all eager to learn, and we use the internet and libraries, etc. Of course, that only takes you so far. There's certain areas where we can't get into, i.e. university libraries and archives and things. We do have, occasionally we have academics visiting us on a private basis. And of course, as soon as we find out who they are, we try to brainwash them and glean as much information off them as we can and use that, what knowledge they have. It isn't just the abbey itself, the building. We've now started going out, like the estates of Crowland and the people and the drainage of the fens. It all comes into the history of the abbey. And it's so that when people come to the abbey, we can give them the full story of what the abbey is about. What I found was by being there, and I've done it for about 25 years now, you meet a vast different array of people from all walks of life. You suddenly find some of these people sometimes have a little bit of information that might, like in a jigsaw puzzle, it fits that little bit. The other Wednesday I was on duty and a lady came in. She was from Romsey Abbey, and she just started. She'd been working there 2 months as a greeter more than a guide, and she was very nervous about it. And I said, well, you don't need to be. So you just. And they said, well, they asked me all these questions about the abbey. I said, well, when I started, I just had little cards, just information on, little cheat cards like, oh yeah, you will learn. And also I said, if you do your own research, you'll learn it, you'll remember things then. But but I've had a great pleasure out of it over the years, and still do.
The main issue that we have as an organisation is one which affects lots of volunteer organisations. We have a number of departments, some of which are entirely volunteer, and because they're fairly well demarcated, they have their own setup, and people, once they join them, become almost part of the family, know what they're doing, and stay in place. I'm very lucky in as much as a volunteer, I work most of the time in the marketing department, which is a professional part of the organisation. I'm the only volunteer in there. Okay. But it's in other departments which are less well delineated. I think the biggest problem we have is not recruiting volunteers, it's retaining volunteers. And volunteer retention is a fairly difficult thing to do unless you've got a very high degree of supervision. And I think that within our organisation, it is one of the things which I think we could improve on quite significantly. We need to build up a better method of supervision. A lot of our departments, the ones that I'm thinking about, are professionally led, but they're fairly recently set up. And I think there is a struggle in this transition, and it's a long-term transition from a professionally led organisation with volunteers who are core to the whole thing, from an entirely volunteer one. And I think part of it is getting the professionals to understand where their volunteers fit in. They may have had volunteers in other previous roles, but the role of the volunteer within our organisation is different. And I think that how volunteers fit in to each organisation is different, and I think one needs to tailor this to those particular ones. It is very much a question of supervision. I think we've got a lot to learn in terms of supervision. Other people may be able to do it better, but maybe it's a structural thing.
Steampunk is a relatively new concept to a lot of people, and we were extremely grateful to be able to work with the Horological I want to say Society Institute for our big day last year. I did feel that because we brought a little bit something new to it, it opened it up to a new audience. So that was really good. I think we both benefited from that.
So people are sort of
understanding what it's about. You know, it's not sort of some clandestine thing anymore. People, you know, realise it's about a wider picture. It's kind of a subculture in itself. You know, H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. It's kind of, you know, it's a big subcultural thing. So it's great to, you know, sort of bring that to the Horological Institute and bring it to a wider populace, really.
We don't want to be used as sort of like a money-making scheme, I suppose. It's definitely going to be a collaboration between steampunkers and the society or whatever organisation we're working with. It can't just be a case of, oh, we're just going to use this thing that you've got going that seems to be popular at the moment in a case of making money. It's got to definitely be a collaboration, otherwise it just comes across as a bit of a fad, and it can lead to lots of disappointments, I guess, because things have been done that have been said in the name of steampunk and it's not really being steampunk at all. So I think if we're going to be in collaboration with organisations, it's definitely got to be in a way that we're involved. It's not just kind of, oh, stick some gears on it and call it steampunk.
I think one of the good things is that we're a very creative society, and I think being able to bring something new to any other organisation that again is extremely creative, we can bring something new and fresh to a different audience, and I think that's what we did last year. I think it was an extremely successful event. I think we had over 900 people through the door for the Horological Society, and we're hoping to do something even more spectacular again for next year. I think it was a really successful day, and it was a beautiful marriage, really, of old, new, and science fiction and clocks, and yeah, we're very proud to be part of it.
So, the museum that I work for, I'm the collections officer. Been in post for about 18 months, as has the museum manager. So we both started on the same day, and although the museum trust has existed since 1994, and the actual collection was begun in 1858, we are, myself and the manager, are the first employed staff. So as you can imagine, it's been a huge undertaking. The museum's historically been closed to the public. We're now open, yay! And it has just been starting from scratch. I've come in and have found a collection of approximately 10,000 objects. There's no inventory, there's no list of what is in the building, there's no valuations. It's very much been done on a sort of ad hoc basis. The museum's not accredited, so we're currently working towards accreditation, and we've just needed so much support to really get ourselves off the ground. Obviously we want to be accredited, because without accreditation there's less money available, and less money available means you've got less opportunities to improve things. Yeah, it's really ground up, and it was just me had to come up with a sort of documentation plan and really an overall plan for exactly what we were going to do with the collection and how we were going to present it. There had been a curator, weirdly, who was employed by a different company, who wasn't a museum professional. He is an expert horologist, so he understands the workings of the clocks and he understands all the science behind it, but that doesn't necessarily make him the right person to then present that to the public. None of the knowledge around the objects was written down either, so it was all in the ex-curator's head, and a lot of it still is. So I also set up an oral history project with him. He retired 4 years ago. He comes in once a week and we work around the stores and around the museum as well, shelf by shelf, left to right, me with a dictaphone, and I just say, off you go, tell me everything you know about this object, and record him. So I'm hoping next year to set up a volunteer group for people that want to then transcribe that and actually write it all up and create object history files to go with each object. I think we've been in a very, very unique position, because, well, when do you get to start from scratch with a 150, 160-year-old museum? It's been a very unusual journey. but we're getting there now. I feel like I've got a rough handle on what's in the collection. But in terms of sort of difficulties, it's been very hard. But my manager would be able to tell you about this better. But the change management side of it has been something that I know Eleanor has sought a lot of support through lots of different mediums on, because when you have something which is set in a 160-year-old institutionalised way of doing things, to then come in and say, we're going to open to the public, we're going to do it totally differently, we're going to turn it on its head, we're going to bring new audiences in, we're going to bring families in, we're going to try something really different, it scares people, or can potentially scare people. So that's something that we've had to sort of tread very carefully with.
I suppose one of the big things for me is I'm a huge reader. I read a lot. I don't mind reading lots when I go to exhibitions. And even I have found the challenge of there being lots of text in places. But it's incredibly difficult to do it in any other way, to find a different medium to tell people about the objects, whether you're using people to tell them or interactives or whatever other mediums you can think of. They usually cost more money and they take a lot more time.
Oh, challenges. I mean, I certainly have some internal challenges that I'm working with. In terms of the larger industry, I think obviously one of the big things right now that I think so many organizations are facing is our budget cuts and how to cope with that. Especially council-run museums are going to be being hit with huge cuts, and I think it's having an effect on staff and resources. I'm fortunate that I work for an independent museum, so I don't face personally those kinds of pressures in my own role, but I can see it in other places. I think that's going to be a continuing issue in the sector. I also do think, although I don't think this applies in my role as much, but I feel like the sector is widely undervalued in terms of pay. I don't know if that will change, because I mean I've heard a lot of talk about it in conferences and workshops, but I haven't seen any evidence of real change.
I think there are a couple of things for me. One is it's a question of morale at the moment. A lot of people in museums will tell you they love for what they do. They love museums, and it's why so many put up with, like you say, undervalued pay and things like that. So morale can be a big thing, which is probably less a tangible thing. As a more tangible thing, I think it's just how can we support museums with the more creative challenges. A lot of us will have skills like project management, but a lot of other skills that, you know, museums used to have whole teams for designing things and creating interpretation, and that has all gone, and we have to find other ways of doing that. So is that something we can work with the universities on, and not even just students for written interpretation, but theatre design, for example, working with them in some capacities. We've had some experience with that already, and it's brought some really interesting results and expertise that we wouldn't have had previously. So just looking at the mediums they can offer us to see how we can do our job better.
I'd have to echo a lot of what you said there, because I think there's a lot of scope and potential for collaborative work, and widening that current practice a lot more and thinking of creative ways to do that. For example, I think there's lots of collections that struggle with space, with the resources to keep documentation up, to even tackle a backlog, to get new acquisitions in. And I think there could be more collaboration on ways to sort of share resources in that regard. I know people tend to think of their collections as quite separate, but I think we have to think more creatively about how in the future we might be able to kind of think of those as less separate and more fluid. And by sharing resources, I think that is one way you could do that. But I think it's kind of changing mindsets as well.
job, I manage the funding relationships with museums, sometimes with successfully funded museums and sometimes with museums that are looking to get funded or that have been rejected for funding. And I think one of the things that is increasingly becoming obvious as a problem is the financial issues with local authorities, small local authority museums. And over the last kind of 12 months, I've had quite a lot of actually really depressing conversations with organisations where there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of creativity in the way that they do things, but there's just not the funding there, and there's no way really for them to get that because they're kind of trapped by bureaucratic constraints that the local authority impose on them. So that means that there's not the opportunity to be entrepreneurial about making their own income, but equally they're not getting enough money from the local authorities, or the funding that they are getting is being cut incrementally, which means that they're actually ending up having to drop quite core aspects of their offer, which is obviously not ideal. And we're there to hopefully solve some of those issues, but obviously we can't act as a kind of cork to plug all the funding gaps. So that's a bit depressing, but I think one of the really great things about the East Midlands as a region is that there's a lot of areas that have quite a lot of challenges, with economically, the kind of context or social problems. There's quite a lot of poverty, and then areas like kind of rural Lincolnshire. Again, there's rural poverty, but also geographical location of a lot of organisations mean that it's quite difficult for people to get there, and it's quite difficult for them to access kind of networks and support as well. But that means that people have really risen to the challenge, and there's some fantastic, amazing, really inspirational stuff that goes on. I mean, in the sector across the whole of the country, but I think the East Midlands, it's really nice. It's really encouraging and really refreshing to see how much people are trying and how community orientated a lot of the organisations are as well, and they're really interested in engaging different audiences and really there to serve their communities, not just to serve themselves.
I've been in the heritage sector for about 7 years, and I left last week. I'd say I'm a mid-career professional. I started front of house, but there's no way you can make a career in front of house. It simply doesn't pay well enough. It doesn't have the sort of professional respect. My passion really was front of house. It's engaging visitors, telling them about history. I was a costume interpreter. But ultimately, to earn a living wage, you need to progress. So I went into education and community participation, which are wonderful. I mean, when I interviewed for one of my jobs, I said it was a vocation, getting people involved in history and heritage. But I feel like the sector exploits that vocation. It exploits the fact that you're passionate about your job, and the salary simply isn't that good, and quite often you have to do things that are so far over and above your job description just to keep the museum functioning, and because you love the museum you will do it, and I think the sector really thrives on a lot of passionate people, but tends to sometimes spill over into exploiting them.
Well, I'm from the Greens Windmill Trust, which is the charity that took over the running of Greens Windmill in Snanton from the City Council. There was a handover period where the council didn't want to run it anymore, and the trust stepped in as a voluntary organisation to take on the running in 2012. And we've been run by a charity ever since. We're very much led by volunteers. There's only one paid member of staff of the charity, that's me. We do have a miller as well, who is actually paid for by the council as part of our agreement, as part of the trust agreement to take on the windmill. Otherwise, we have a team of about 40 volunteers that help keep us open and operating, and they are the cornerstone of our organisation. Without them, there's no way that the mill would continue to open and do the kind of things that we do. The main focus is the flour, making the organic stone ground flour, but to supplement that we run a lot of events for the public as well. Everything from bread baking, pizza making, to bigger events like Easter egg hunts, autumn fairs, Christmas carols in the mill yard is always one of our most popular events, and all run by volunteers. And yeah, so one of the main things we found, especially to start with, was that we were a young organisation and we didn't necessarily have the right experience or the right people in the right places, but that's something the charity's worked on, especially the governance side of things over the last 5 years. And again, with the help and support of our volunteers, we've really come on in leaps and bounds. We were actually awarded the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service this year, which is the MBE for volunteer groups. So you can't beat the Royal Stamp of Approval. And we're now just trying to move the charity forward. We're a free entry site, so with things like the flower and the events and room hires, that will help support the charity to keep them open and operating, and also allows us to offer a free educational resource and a free heritage resource.
My background is producing large-scale digital heritage trails. The project probably takes about 2 years to put together. You meet lots of people. I drink too much coffee, I smoke too many fags, and I think that's the hardest part of the job. But really, the most difficult thing is finding the time to fill out an Arts Council grant form. The Arts Council are the main funders of the project I do. And I can't even access the files on the website. I find it so difficult to navigate. Just as I start to do some of it, it crashes or I lose where I am. And then I give up, and then I go back to talking to more people about this great idea I've got. I get them involved, and then I go back to the Arts Council website again, and I just can't face it. So you need money to pay all these wonderful people that have agreed to get involved in your project, but actually finding the time and the will to fill out an Arts Council form I find really difficult. So maybe if the process was simplified in some way, maybe if there was some more direct support, that would be great. But without the Arts Council, I wouldn't have been able to do Dawn in Red, Facilitator and other projects. I love them to bits. They give me a fantastic opportunity, but God, that form is a nightmare.